the deeds are executed.
This is madness. They'll ruin everything we built.
We must stop this.
On August 14, 1832, in the sweltering heat of Jefferson County, Mississippi, a county clerk named Josiah Pemberton sat in his cramped office, surrounded by ledgers and the oppressive humidity that made ink run if you weren't careful. He unfolded a last will and testament, its parchment yellowed at the edges, dated 3 years prior. The testator, Colonel Silas Mayfield, had died 2 days earlier, a massive stroke that felled him in his own cotton fields, his face pressed into the black soil that had made him wealthy. Pemberton's eyes scanned the formal legal language, the whereas and heretofores, until he reached the disposition of property. There, in unmistakable copperplate script, was the signature he'd witnessed himself in 1829, and beneath it, a clause that made his breath catch. To my wife, Eleanor Constance Mayfield, I bequeath in totality my earthly estate, lands, chattel, and all holdings herein described, to be administered solely at her discretion. The man was dead. His wife, the woman the entire county had pitied, the obese recluse who hadn't been seen in public in over 5 years, whom Silas himself had called useless as tits on a boar at more than one gentleman's dinner, had just become the wealthiest, most powerful woman in Jefferson County. She controlled 2,000 acres of prime Delta cotton land, a manor house worth more than most men would see in 10 lifetimes, and the lives of 137 enslaved human beings. In a society where women could barely control their own clothing allowances, Eleanor Mayfield now held dominion over an empire. Pemberton set down his pen, knowing that what he was about to record would ignite a firestorm. He was right. Within hours, the news had spread through Jefferson County like cholera, and the outrage had begun. Character count, 1,847. Let me expand this further. On August 14, 1832, in the sweltering, suffocating heat of Jefferson County, Mississippi, a county clerk named Josiah Pemberton sat in his cramped office on Main Street, surrounded by leather-bound ledgers, scattered correspondence, and the oppressive delta humidity that made ink run across parchment if you weren't careful with your blotter. The afternoon sun slanted through wavy glass windows, illuminating dust motes that hung in the air like suspended judgment. He unfolded a last will and testament, its parchment yellowed at the edges, the wax seal already broken by the executor's attorney that morning. The document was dated May 17, 1829, 3 years, 2 months and 27 days prior to this moment. The testator, Colonel Silas Mayfield, had died 2 days earlier of a massive apoplectic stroke that felled him in his own cotton fields during the peak of inspection season, his weathered face pressed into the same black alluvial soil that had made him one of the wealthiest men in the state. Pemberton adjusted his spectacles, small round things that pinched his nose, and began reading through the formal legal language with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd probated hundreds of estates. The whereas and heretofores blurred together in their predictable rhythm, the standard boilerplate about being of sound mind and body, and disposing of worldly goods. He expected the usual. Primary heir would be a son, perhaps, or given the Mayfield's childless state, a brother or nephew. The cotton operation, the land, the enslaved workforce, all of it would pass to another man as it always did, as the law and custom demanded. His pen was already poised to record the transfer in the county registry. But then his eyes found the disposition clause, and his hand froze mid-air. There, in unmistakable copperplate script, the kind of penmanship that spoke of expensive education and absolute confidence, was the signature he'd witnessed himself in the spring of 1829, along with fellow witness Thomas Garrett, now deceased. And beneath it, in language so clear it could not be misinterpreted, so deliberate it could only have been intentional, was a clause that made his breath catch in his throat. To my wife, Eleanor Constance Mayfield, born Eleanor Hartwell of Virginia, I bequeath in totality and without condition my earthly estate, including all lands, improvements, chattel both human and otherwise, livestock, furnishings, debts owed to me, and all holdings herein described and catalogued in Appendix A to B. Administered solely and completely at her discretion, without oversight of guardian, brother, or male relation, for the duration of her natural life. Pemberton read it again. Then a third time. His legal training told him it was airtight, unusual, extraordinarily unusual, but perfectly legal under Mississippi territorial law as codified in 1822. There were no conditions, no trustees, no male overseers mentioned anywhere in the document. It was a direct transfer of absolute power. The man was dead, his body barely cold in the parlor of Mayfield Manor where it lay in state awaiting burial. His wife, the woman the entire county had pitied for a decade, the obese recluse who hadn't been seen in public society in over 5 years, who hadn't attended church or social functions since before Pemberton himself had taken office, whom Silas himself had mockingly called useless as tits on a boar at more than one gentleman's dinner party, whose very name was spoken with a mixture of pity and contempt by the ladies of Jefferson County, had just become, in a single stroke of probate law, the wealthiest and most powerful woman in the entire county, possibly in all of Mississippi. Eleanor Mayfield now controlled 2,000 acres of prime Mississippi Delta cotton land, some of the richest soil in North America. She controlled a manor house worth more than most men would see in 10 lifetimes, with its imported furniture, its library of over 400 volumes, its crystal chandeliers shipped from Boston. She controlled cotton gins, warehouses, equipment, livestock, and debts owed by half the merchants in Natchez. And most significantly, most troublingly for everyone who would soon learn of this transfer, she now held complete dominion over the lives of 137 enslaved human beings, men, women, and children whose bodies were property, whose labor generated the wealth, whose existence formed the entire foundation of the Mayfield fortune. In a society where women could barely control their own clothing allowances, where a wife's property automatically became her husband's upon marriage, where female testimony in court was subordinate to any man's, Eleanor Mayfield now held dominion over an empire. She could sell land. She could negotiate contracts. She could discipline, sell, or, and this thought would soon terrify her neighbors, potentially free human property. Pemberton carefully set down his pen, knowing that what he was about to record in the county registry would ignite a firestorm of controversy. He was right. Within hours of the will's filing, the news had spread through Jefferson County like cholera in summer, transmitted from the courthouse to the cotton exchange to the steps of the Baptist church to the parlors where women gathered for afternoon tea. And with that news came outrage, disbelief, and the first whispers that would soon become shouts. This had to be a mistake, an error of the pen, perhaps even evidence of the colonel's declining mental state in his final years. Surely, they said, surely this could be challenged, overturned, corrected. A woman like Eleanor Mayfield, grotesquely fat, childless, useless, could not possibly be allowed to control such wealth, such power, such responsibility. Could she? The Mississippi Delta in 1832 was not merely a geographic location. It was a carefully constructed hierarchy of power, wealth, and human suffering, built on soil so fertile it was called black gold by the men who owned it and blood earth by those who worked it in chains. Jefferson County sat in the heart of this system, a patchwork of massive plantations separated by narrow roads that turned to impassable mud every winter. The county seat, a small cluster of buildings optimistically called Greenville, consisted of a courthouse, a cotton exchange, 2 churches, a general store, a tavern, and perhaps 24 residences. But the real power existed not in town but in the plantation manors that dotted the countryside. The Worthington place with its 180 enslaved workers, the Bradford plantation with 220, and largest of all, the Mayfield estate with 137 souls in bondage and 2,000 acres under cultivation. Eleanor Hartwell had arrived in Mississippi in 1819 as a bride of 22, the youngest daughter of a declining Virginia tobacco family who saw marriage to Colonel Silas Mayfield as strategic alliance. Contemporary letters describe her as handsome in a sturdy way, and of adequate intelligence for a woman. She brought a modest dowry of $800 and several trunks of books, unusual for a bride. Silas, 15 years her senior with 400 acres and 30 enslaved workers, seemed pleased with the match. The marriage appears conventionally unhappy. No children came. By 1823, Eleanor had begun gaining weight. By 1827 she was grossly obese, and by 1830 her husband's correspondence described her as a monument to idleness and gluttony. Medical understanding of obesity in antebellum Mississippi was morally diagnostic. Physicians believed excessive weight resulted from constitutional weakness and moral failing. Dr. Samuel Cartwright argued that obesity in women indicated fundamental imbalance of feminine temperament, a surrender to base appetites. For a plantation wife, whose role required delicate refinement and production of heirs, Eleanor's body represented double failure. She had also ceased attending social functions after 1827. She was, they concluded, useless, pitiable but irrelevant to the serious business of cotton and commerce. What Jefferson County society could not see was what Eleanor did during her seclusion. While Silas managed fields and maintained his reputation as a hard enslaver, Eleanor claimed the plantation's library as her domain. The room was unusual, a dedicated space with floor-to-ceiling shelves, a large oak desk and eastern windows. Silas had built it as display of culture, then ignored it. Eleanor filled it. The estate inventory reveals 427 volumes. Classical literature, philosophy, agricultural treatises, medical texts, legal commentaries and notably, works on political economy including Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations and Thomas Paine's Rights of Man. Dangerous reading in Mississippi, nearly seditious for a woman. Eleanor did more than read. Evidence discovered decades later revealed she maintained her own archive of plantation operations. While Silas kept official ledgers of cotton yields and profits, Eleanor kept something else: detailed records of the enslaved population. She documented births with the mother's name first, a radical inversion of plantation record-keeping. She recorded deaths with causes: fever, childbed, injury from mill, despair. She noted family relationships official records ignored: who was sister to whom, which children belonged to which mothers who had been sold away. She tracked the punishment book: March 12, 1828, Caesar 15 lashes moving too slowly. July 3, 1829 Ruth 10 lashes, speaking back to overseer. These documents later surfaced in abolitionist publications as devastating evidence of systematic violence. Most radically, letters discovered in the 1970s suggest Eleanor taught basic literacy to enslaved house servants since 1826, a criminal act under Mississippi law. The evidence is fragmentary. A letter from 1831 references, "the words you showed me that the quiet lady taught." Another mentions lessons in the back room when the master rode to town. Eleanor had been conducting a covert school for years, using her supposed invalidism and her husband's contempt as cover. The fat, useless wife was teaching enslaved people to read, documenting slavery's violence and waiting. When Silas fell dead on August 12, 1832, Eleanor sent for the body calmly, instructed the physician, then sent for attorney Samuel R. Green and had the will filed immediately. It was the behavior of someone who had been ready. The useless wife had been preparing for power all along. Silas Mayfield died on August 12, 1832, at approximately 3 in the afternoon during his weekly cotton field inspection. Witnesses reported he had been demanding that morning, examining plants and criticizing techniques. Around midday, Overseer James Hackett noticed Silas leaning against a fence post, face flushed crimson despite the shade of his hat. "Colonel seemed unsteady," Hackett later testified. "I asked if he needed water but he waved me off." 3 hours later, Silas collapsed between cotton rows. By the time workers carried him to the manor, he was dead, what Dr. Marcus Webb diagnosed as apoplectic seizure. By evening, a dozen planters had gathered at Mayfield Manor to assess the situation. Silas had been significant in county commerce. Cotton Exchange Board member, creditor to numerous smaller planters, controller of enough acreage to influence regional prices. His death created a vacuum. The men spoke in hushed tones while Eleanor remained upstairs, appropriate they thought for a grieving widow, though several noted they heard no weeping. The general assumption, articulated by Silas's brother Colonel James Mayfield, was that the estate would pass to male control. James began making arrangements to relocate and manage affairs during this difficult transition. The will reading on August 14 was expected to be a formality. Attorney Samuel R. Green arrived from Natchez with the sealed 1829 will. The gathering included James Mayfield, 3 neighboring planters, Overseer Hackett and curious townspeople. Clerk Josiah Pemberton broke the seal and began reading. Initial provisions were standard: small bequests, a church donation, provisions for the overseer. Then Pemberton reached the main clause and his voice caught. He read it silently before continuing, "To my wife, Eleanor Constance Mayfield, I bequeath in totality my earthly estate." James was on his feet instantly. "That cannot be correct. Let me see that document." Green spoke for the first time. "The will is properly executed, properly witnessed, and entirely legal under Mississippi law." James snatched the document, scanning with growing agitation. "This is madness. Silas would never. Eleanor cannot possibly manage an estate of this size. She has no experience, no knowledge of operations, no," he gestured vaguely. "She is unwell. This must be an error of the pen, something drafted in haste without proper consideration." The murmuring grew louder. Planter Thomas Worthington voiced what others thought. "A woman cannot control over 100 slaves. It's not natural, not safe, it sets a dangerous precedent." Another man was more blunt. "That fat cow couldn't manage a henhouse, let alone the largest cotton operation in the county." Silas must have been out of his mind. Green stood formally. "Gentlemen, I understand your concerns but the law is clear. Mrs. Mayfield is the sole heir and executor. The will contains no provisions for trustees, no requirements for male oversight, no conditions on her authority. She has full legal control as of her husband's death. The room erupted. Over the following week, 3 separate delegations visited Mayfield Manor attempting to convince Eleanor to cede control to James or accept a male trustee. She received none of them, sending messages through her house servant that she was in mourning and could not receive visitors. This refusal, considered deeply improper, fueled speculation about her competence. Bradford Plantation owner William Bradford wrote to his cousin, "The Mayfield situation grows more troubling daily. The woman refuses counsel, refuses male guidance, and apparently intends to maintain control herself. What message does this send to our own slaves to see a woman, an obese, childless woman no less, wielding such power? The natural order has been inverted." When clerks confirmed the will's validity after 2 weeks, finding no technical flaws, no evidence of coercion, no grounds for challenge, shock curdled into outrage. James filed a formal objection arguing Silas had suffered declining mental capacity and the will should be set aside. The objection was weak, but it forced a hearing that delayed property transfer. During this liminal period, Eleanor took control anyway. Using her position as widow and physical possession of the estate, she issued instructions to Hackett. She ordered complete inventory of all property. She demanded daily operational reports. She reviewed financial accounts personally, questioning expenditures. Most shockingly, she conducted personal interviews with enslaved workers without the overseer present, a protocol violation discussed in scandalized whispers for months. The October 1832 probate hearing lasted 3 days. James's attorney presented witnesses testifying to Eleanor's reclusiveness, obesity, lack of public engagement, all suggesting mental incapacity. But Green countered with devastating precision. He presented detailed plantation records Eleanor had maintained for years, demonstrating superior knowledge of estate operations. He called Dr. Webb, who testified that while Eleanor was obese, she showed no signs of insanity, dementia, or mental defect. He introduced business correspondence Eleanor had conducted with Natchez cotton factors, revealing she had been involved in commercial decisions throughout her marriage just quietly. The judge ruled in Eleanor's favor. The will stood. Eleanor Mayfield, the woman the county had pitted and dismissed, now legally controlled the largest plantation in Jefferson County. The courthouse erupted in chaos, but the law had spoken. The useless wife had become the most powerful person in the room. The historical reconstruction of Eleanor Mayfield's interior life requires piecing together fragmentary evidence scattered across archives in 3 states, spanning 150 years of discovery. The most significant breakthrough came in 1891, when a donation to the Massachusetts Historical Society from abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison's estate included a leather-bound ledger with no clear provenance. The ledger, approximately 9 by 12 inches, contained meticulous records dated 1826 to 1837. The handwriting was identified in 1934 as matching Eleanor Mayfield's verified signatures. What Garrison's papers contained was Eleanor's secret archive, the parallel record-keeping system she had maintained for over a decade, hidden from everyone. The ledger is remarkable for its systematic inversion of plantation conventions. Standard ledgers treated enslaved people as depreciating assets, listing them by value, age, and productive capacity. Names, when recorded, were often single: Caesar, Ruth, Tom, with no family relationships. Eleanor's ledger does the opposite. Each entry begins with a full name when known, often including surnames that enslaved people used among themselves but that were denied legal recognition. Sarah Mitchell, born 1804, mother of James, born in 1822, Lucy, born in 1824, and infant Samuel, born in 1828, died 1829 of summer fever. Caesar Freeman, born approximately 1795 in Virginia, purchased 1812, carpenter and millwright, husband of Patience, father of 6 including Augustus, who was sold to Bradford Plantation 1827. The ledger reconstructs family networks that official records deliberately obscured. But the ledger contains more than genealogy. Eleanor tracked the violence with clinical precision. She copied entries from Overseer Hackett's punishment book. June 14, 1827, Moses, 20 lashes for alleged laziness. July 2, 1827, Hannah, 15 lashes for breaking dish. September 18, 1827, Peter, 25 lashes and 1 day in stocks for speaking disrespectfully. She recorded work injuries. March 1828, Daniel lost 2 fingers in cotton gin. May 1829, Ruth suffered back injury, unable to work 3 weeks, was denied medical care. She documented deaths with causes official records euphemized: infant mortality from inadequate nutrition, childbed death due to forced field work until day of labor, suicide by drowning. One 1830 entry reads, Thomas, age 16, hanged himself in the barn. Hackett called it laziness. I call it murder. When excerpts were published in 1850s abolitionist newspapers, they provided some of the most detailed contemporary documentation of plantation violence available to Northern readers. The question of how Eleanor obtained this information, how she gained the enslaved community's trust, leads to the most radical element: literacy instruction. Evidence comes from multiple sources, none conclusive alone but compelling in aggregate. First, the 1970 discovery of an 1856 letter by Sarah Mitchell Freeman, who identified herself as formerly enslaved at Mayfield, describing the master's wife who taught us letters in secret, who showed us that marks on paper could speak. A second letter from 1983 describes the lady in the big house who would call us to bring water, but who would sit us down and show us the alphabet, making us memorize shapes so no paper evidence would remain. The most detailed account comes from Augustus Freeman's 1867 narrative, 12 Years in Mississippi Bondage and My Path to Freedom. Freeman describes lessons in Eleanor's library when Silas was in Natchez. Mrs. Mayfield would position one of us at the window to watch for the master's return. She taught 3 or 4 at a time, using a hornbook and slate she would hide beneath floorboards when lessons ended. She taught us to read using the Bible, which would seem less suspicious if discovered, though she also brought newspapers from Natchez and taught us about the world beyond the plantation. Freeman's account provides specific details: the loose floorboard location, the signal system, Eleanor's teaching method, suggesting genuine memory. Teaching enslaved people to read was explicitly illegal under Mississippi's 1823 Act, which prescribed $500 fines and 6 months imprisonment. The law reflected slaveholders' fear that literacy would facilitate escape, enable abolitionist communication, and undermine slavery's ideological justification. Eleanor's decision to violate this law systematically for years represents extraordinary risk that makes sense only if we understand her as engaged in long-term preparation for the moment when she would gain control and would need allies who could read contracts, understand legal documents, and navigate a world of written authority. The Mayfield Library inventory reveals Eleanor's intellectual engagement with abolitionist thought. Among 427 books were works challenging slavery's foundations: Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations critiquing unfree labor as economically inefficient, Thomas Paine's Rights of Man with radical egalitarianism, and most dangerously, David Walker's 1829 appeal to the colored citizens of the world, considered so inflammatory that possession was illegal in most southern states. How Eleanor acquired Walker's appeal remains unknown, but its presence indicates engagement with the period's most radical abolitionist literature. Medical records provide another lens. Dr. Webb's preserved notes describe Eleanor in 1830 as weighing in excess of 280 pounds, experiencing significant difficulty with ambulation, suffering from joint pain and respiratory distress. But Webb also notes that the patient's mental faculties remain entirely sound. Indeed, her conversation demonstrates superior intellect and remarkable recall of complex subjects. Modern medical historians have analyzed Eleanor's case in context of obesity's multiple causes. Some suggest she may have suffered from what we now recognize as polycystic ovary syndrome or thyroid disorders, conditions causing weight gain and infertility but leaving cognitive function intact. Others propose a more provocative interpretation, that Eleanor may have recognized, consciously or unconsciously, that her obesity provided protective camouflage. A woman who could not easily leave her home, who was dismissed as physically incapable and morally weak, was a woman who would not be suspected of subversion. Her body became protective coloring in a surveillance society. The surveillance aspect of plantation life cannot be overstated. Enslaved people watched, overseers watched, planters watched, everyone in an intricate system of mutual observation designed to prevent rebellion or escape. For Eleanor to conduct literacy lessons, maintain forbidden records, and acquire prohibited books, she had to exploit the one blind spot in this system: the contempt that made her invisible. Her husband did not supervise her because he believed her incapable of anything significant. The overseer did not report her interactions because he assumed a useless woman posed no threat. Her neighbors did not investigate because they had written her off as pitiable. Eleanor's greatest asset was being underestimated. Once Eleanor secured legal control in October 1832, She faced the practical problem of translating abolitionist convictions into action within a legal system designed to prevent exactly what she intended. Mississippi's 1822 slave code was brutally clear. No enslaver could legally free more than 10 enslaved people without explicit state legislature permission. Applications required detailed justification, public notice, legislative debate, and were almost universally denied. For Eleanor to free the 137 people she controlled through conventional manumission was effectively impossible. Attorney Samuel R. Greene provided the solution. Born in Massachusetts in 1791, Harvard-trained in law, Greene had moved to Natchez in 1817. His preserved correspondence reveals deep conflict about slavery. He represented slaveholders, that was the business of law in Mississippi, but his private letters express moral revulsion. An 1828 letter to his brother describes slavery as a cancer upon the body politic, metastasizing through every aspect of Southern life. In Eleanor he found a client willing to take extraordinary risks. Greene's strategy was technically legal but functionally subversive, reclassification rather than manumission. Mississippi law governing enslaved people was extensive, but law governing free laborers and tenant farmers was ambiguous. Greene proposed exploiting this gap. First, Eleanor would subdivide plantation portions into parcels of 40 to 80 acres. Second, she would execute tenant farming contracts with specific individuals, granting land use rights for crop yield percentages. Third, she would cease treating contracted individuals as enslaved property, instead treating them as legal parties to enforceable contracts. The strategy never explicitly declared anyone free, it simply stopped treating them as enslaved. The first contracts were executed in January 1833. Greene drafted them with meticulous legal precision. Each named a specific individual, using full names from Eleanor's secret ledger, and granted use rights to a specific parcel for 5 years, renewable. Contracts specified crop sharing, typically 60% to the tenant, 40% to Eleanor. Most importantly, they included provisions typical of free labor, restrictions on the landowner's right to relocate the tenant, protections against physical punishment, and acknowledgement that the tenant could enter other contracts, including marriage contracts recognized under law. By treating enslaved people as legal persons capable of contracting, Eleanor was functionally emancipating them. Eleanor selected 10 families initially, approximately 35 people, choosing those longest on the plantation. Contracts were recorded with the county clerk as required, but their significance was missed. Clerk Pemberton assumed they were ordinary tenant farming arrangements. Only when more contracts were filed in March, then a dozen in April, did people realize what was happening. By the time neighboring planters recognized the pattern, nearly 60 people had been reclassified. In May 1833, planters led by William Bradford filed a formal complaint alleging illegal manumission disguised as contract law. They argued Eleanor was circumventing the 10-person manumission limit and threatening plantation system stability. The complaint demanded the sheriff seize reclassified individuals and charge Eleanor with violating manumission laws. Sheriff Robert Tanner was inclined to act. But Greene blocked him, threatening to sue Tanner personally for breach of contract if he interfered with Eleanor's legally recorded agreements. The August 1833 hearing drew regional observers. If upheld, any enslaver could theoretically empty their plantation through similar reclassification. If invalidated, courts could pierce contractual forms to enforce slavery regardless of written agreements. Greene's argument was deliberately paradoxical. Eleanor had entered valid contracts for land use with individuals she continued to own. Contracts did not transfer ownership, they governed labor terms. He maintained the individuals were Eleanor's property, avoiding manumission law, while treating them as legal persons capable of contracting, establishing rights the law did not recognize for enslaved people. Judge Clarence Whitmore faced a dilemma. Contracts were technically legal, but their practical effect threatened plantation labor control. His September 1833 ruling upheld contracts as valid property rights exercises but ruled contracted individuals remained legal property subject to sale or debt seizure. The ruling satisfied no one but left contracts in place. Eleanor accelerated the program through late 1833 and 1834, executing contracts for most remaining families. But social costs mounted. Neighboring planters refused business with anyone associated with the Mayfield estate. Cotton factors declined to handle Mayfield cotton. Merchants refused credit. The Baptist Church expelled Eleanor. Violence began. November 1833 masked raids destroyed a cabin and beat a tenant farmer severely. January 1834 saw a tobacco barn burned. Eleanor documented everything and reported to Sheriff Tanner, who declined to investigate. Crisis came in March 1835 when planters led by James Mayfield petitioned to have Eleanor declared mentally incompetent. The petition argued her obesity evidenced hysteria and weak moral character, her reclusive behavior indicated instability, her failure to maintain discipline demonstrated incompetence, and her systematic dismantling of plantation labor proved insanity. No sane woman would deliberately destroy property value. They demanded the court appoint James as guardian with authority to void contracts and restore traditional operations. The June 1835 competency hearing packed the courtroom with journalists from Natchez and New Orleans. Petitioners presented witnesses, neighbors who testified they had not seen Eleanor in years, medical experts claiming obesity indicated mental deficiency, overseers testifying her labor arrangements were economically irrational. By antebellum standards, a woman deliberately undermining her economic interests could reasonably be judged incompetent. Green's defense put Eleanor on the witness stand, almost unprecedented for a Mississippi woman. Eleanor, absent from public for years, arrived in a specially constructed chair carried by 4 men. She wore full morning dress. She was imposing and composed. Green questioned her about plantation operations, crop rotations, cotton prices, debt management, equipment maintenance. Eleanor answered with detailed precision, demonstrating comprehensive knowledge. She recited figures from memory, explained complex agricultural decisions, discussed market conditions with experienced planter fluency. It was devastating. Green then introduced Eleanor's ledgers as evidence of mental capacity and careful management. The secret records demonstrated systematic, rational record-keeping superior to most planters. Judge Samuel Harrison rendered his verdict. Eleanor Mayfield was legally competent. The petition was denied. Contracts remained in force. Eleanor had survived the most serious challenge to her authority, but victory had costs. Isolation intensified, pressure increased, violence continued. She had used law to create space for freedom within slavery, but could not use law to protect those occupying that space. That required endurance, documentation, and hope. Between 1833 and 1837, Eleanor Mayfield's contract system transformed the labor structure of Jefferson County's largest plantation. By end of 1834, approximately 73 people, about 20 families, had been reclassified from enslaved property to contracted tenant farmers. By 1836, that number reached 92. The transformation was neither complete nor uniform. Some enslaved people remained in traditional bondage, either because Eleanor judged them unready, because they feared semi-freedom's risks, or because estate management required maintaining some traditional arrangements. The result was a hybrid system unprecedented in antebellum Mississippi, a single plantation containing both enslaved workers and nominally free tenant farmers in uneasy proximity. The tenant farmers faced extraordinary challenges. They were legally ambiguous, not enslaved per their contracts but not recognized as free under state law. They could not leave Jefferson County without passes. They could not testify in court against white people. They could not vote or serve on juries. Yet they controlled their own labor, kept most crop yields, and could not be arbitrarily sold or separated from families. They occupied liminal space between slavery and freedom that law had no language to describe. Contemporary observers struggled to categorize them. Some called them quasi-free, others contracted slaves, still others refused to acknowledge any distinction. The most significant development was Freedman's Bend, later known as Eleanor's Crossing, a concentrated settlement of tenant farmers on the northern Mayfield estate. By 1835, approximately 40 people were living there, building their own cabins, cultivating their own plots, creating community structure resembling free black northern settlements more than traditional slave quarters. The settlement had no official legal status. It was simply clustered individual contracts on adjacent parcels, but it functioned as semi-autonomous community. Residents held meetings to coordinate planting and harvest. They established mutual aid systems supporting families during illness or crop failure. Most remarkably, they created a covert school where Eleanor's literacy instruction was now transmitted to many, with evening classes after field work. County archives provide glimpses of internal organization. Property records show Eleanor had deeded land use rights to tenant farmers in ways allowing them to pass rights to heirs, creating de facto property ownership even though legal title remained with Eleanor. Marriage records, which enslaved people could not create but free people could, begin appearing for Freedman's Bend residents starting in 1835, as Eleanor encouraged contracted tenants to formalize unions the law would recognize. Birth records for children born to contracted tenants after 1834 list children with two-part names and identify parents by full names, treating them as free persons. These were small legal victories accumulating into something larger. Documentary record recognizing humanity the law denied. But violence intensified as Freedmen's Bend became more visible. Vigilante raids occurred with grim regularity. November 1835 barn burning, February 1836 cabin attack, May 1836 beating of 3 men traveling to sell crops. Perpetrators were never officially identified, though everyone knew attacks came from neighboring planters determined to make Eleanor's experiment fail. Sheriff Tanner continued refusing to investigate. When Eleanor attempted hiring private security, no white men in Jefferson County would accept employment, and arming black men, even nominally free ones, was illegal. Eleanor responded through documentation. Her ledgers from this period meticulously record every act of violence. Dates, victims, injuries, property damage, estimated perpetrators. She wrote letters to Mississippi's governor, federal authorities, northern abolitionist newspapers. Most received no response or were dismissed as complaints from a mentally unstable woman. But some reached sympathetic audiences. In 1836, excerpts appeared in William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator, providing Northern readers detailed accounts of anti-black violence in Mississippi and systematic resistance to even partial emancipation. Publication further isolated Eleanor in Jefferson County but connected her to a broader abolitionist network that would preserve her legacy. Economic pressure on the Mayfield estate was severe and mounting. Cotton production declined significantly, not because tenant farmers were less productive than enslaved workers, but because Eleanor's isolation meant she could not access normal commercial channels. Cotton factors in Natchez refused to handle Mayfield crops after 1834, forcing direct sales at significant discounts. Greenville merchants would not extend credit for supplies, requiring cash payments Eleanor increasingly struggled to provide. The estate's financial position deteriorated throughout the mid-1830s. By 1836, Eleanor was selling land to pay debts, land she sold to the tenant farmers working it, using complex legal arrangements allowing nominally enslaved people to effectively purchase their own freedom and the ground beneath their feet. Eleanor's health declined in parallel with estate finances. Dr. Webb's 1836 medical notes describe increasing symptoms: severe joint pain limiting mobility further, respiratory distress suggesting heart strain, and what Webb called melancholic disposition, that might have been clinical depression. Eleanor was in her late 30s but physically aged beyond her years. Yet she continued her work with grim determination. Her correspondence shows no self-pity despite social ostracism, economic ruin, and physical suffering. Instead, letters focus on legal strategies, financial arrangements, and protecting tenant farmers. A November 1836 letter to Greene is typical. "My health continues poor, but my resolve remains firm. The contracts must be maintained. The documentation must continue. If I have contributed nothing else to this world, let it be said I bore witness." By 1837, the situation had reached unstable equilibrium. Eleanor had successfully reclassified most of the Mayfield plantation's labor force, creating tenant farming as de facto emancipation. She had survived multiple legal challenges and established precedents demonstrating that alternatives to traditional slavery were technically possible within Mississippi law. But costs had been enormous. Social isolation, economic devastation, physical decline, constant violence against the people she was trying to protect. The Freedmen's Bend settlement persisted but under siege. Tenant farmers maintained contracts but lived in daily fear. And Eleanor herself, increasingly ill and confined to Mayfield Manor, continued documenting, knowing her immediate impact was limited but hoping the record she was creating would someday matter. She was running out of time but she was not finished. Eleanor Mayfield died on February 14, 1838, at approximately 2 in the morning. The cause, according to Dr. Webb's death certificate, was cardiac failure secondary to chronic corpulence and general debility. She was 39 years old. Her death was not unexpected. Her health had been declining for over a year, but its timing was significant. Eleanor died while drafting her final testament, a document even more radical than the contract system she had created. The unfinished draft, found on her desk by Sarah Mitchell, was covered in ink corrections and marginal notes, suggesting Eleanor had been working on it until hours before death. She knew she was dying and was determined to use her final legal act to secure the future of the people she had spent years protecting. Within hours, James Mayfield arrived at the manor with 2 men, claiming his right as nearest male relative to take possession. He was met by Attorney Green, who had been summoned by Sarah Mitchell and arrived with the magistrate and Eleanor's will, deposited with him 3 days earlier in final form. James demanded access to the house, ledgers, and immediate control of all property. Green refused, presenting the sealed will and invoking probate law prohibiting property transfer until proper filing and validation. Magistrate Horace Blackwell sided with Green. James was forced to leave but promised the will would not stand. The will filed February 16, 1838 immediately provoked controversy. It ran 7 pages but its provisions were straightforward and revolutionary. First, Eleanor forgave all debts owed by tenant farmers under contract. Second, she transferred legal title of land parcels worked by contracted tenants directly to those tenants, converting use rights into fee simple ownership, the strongest property ownership form. Third, she established a trust fund with remaining assets, approximately $3,400, to provide legal defense for tenant farmers facing challenges. Fourth, she manumitted outright the remaining enslaved people not yet under contract, using her right to free up to 10 people then exceeding that limit by classifying additional people as freed for meritorious service, a category vaguely defined in Mississippi law. The will made Eleanor the first Southern plantation owner, and first Southern woman, to bequeath land directly to formerly enslaved black families prior to the Civil War. The legal mechanism was complex and dubious, relying on contractual arrangements blurring slavery and freedom, but the practical effect was clear. Approximately 65 people gained legal land ownership, and another 30 gained freedom outright. Remaining individuals were to be sold and proceeds added to the legal defense fund. It was a compromise. Eleanor could not free everyone without triggering legal invalidation, but it was the most aggressive wealth redistribution from white to black that Mississippi law would see for 30 years. The Mayfield heirs contested immediately. The March 1838 challenge argued Eleanor had been mentally incompetent despite the 1835 ruling, that land transfers violated public policy by creating black landowners in slave society, that manumissions exceeded legal limits, and that the will was fraud perpetrated by Green to advance abolitionism. The case was assigned to Mississippi Chancery Court, and observers expected a long trial likely resulting in the will being overturned. What happened instead was stranger. The June 1838 hearing lasted only 4 days, remarkably short for such complexity. Heirs presented arguments and called witnesses, including medical experts testifying post-mortem about Eleanor's obesity as insanity evidence and neighbors describing her radical actions. But Green's defense was brief, focused not on Eleanor's mental state but on narrow property law technicalities. He argued land transfers were valid exercises of Eleanor's property rights as sole owner, that provisions were consistent with Mississippi law regardless of policy implications, and that heirs had no standing to challenge Eleanor's decisions about her property. He presented Eleanor's meticulous records demonstrating competence and careful management. Most significantly, he introduced correspondence between Eleanor and Mississippi legislators discussing estate plans, suggesting some officials had privately approved or not objected. Judge Chancellor William Sharkey was complicated. A slaveholder himself and no abolitionist, Sharkey was nonetheless a legal formalist believing strongly in property rights and contractual freedom. His August 1838 ruling was a masterpiece of narrow legal reasoning avoiding broader moral implications. Sharkey upheld most of Eleanor's will on technical grounds while limiting its precedential effect. He ruled land transfers valid because Eleanor had the right to dispose of property as she saw fit and because transfers had been executed before death through the contract system, making them completed transactions rather than testamentary bequests. He validated manumissions for people Eleanor classified as freed for meritorious service. However, he ruled the will could not serve as precedent because Eleanor's situation was unique and not to be replicated. But Sharkey added crucial limitation. Land titles transferred to tenant farmers, while valid, remained subject to all existing debts and encumbrances on the Mayfield estate. Since the estate was deeply in debt by 1838, from years of economic isolation and declining cotton revenues, creditors could potentially seize land to satisfy Eleanor's debts. The ruling gave formerly enslaved families legal title but left it vulnerable. It satisfied no one but allowed Sharkey to rule in favor on narrow grounds while providing mechanism for property transfers to be undone through debt collection rather than direct invalidation. The Mayfield heirs appealed to Mississippi Supreme Court. The appeal focused on public policy, that allowing black land ownership violated fundamental social order and should be prohibited regardless of technical property law. The case reached state Supreme Court in November 1838, with oral arguments scheduled for January 1839. But mysteriously, the heirs abruptly withdrew their appeal in December 1838, weeks before arguments. No official explanation was given. Historians have speculated political pressure was applied. Mississippi was entering economic depression, and leaders may have wanted to avoid a high-profile case drawing northern attention. Others suggest the heirs reached private settlement with Greene. Still others argue he heirs simply calculated they were unlikely to win and that continuing litigation would generate legal fees and negative publicity. Whatever the reason, withdrawal meant Sharkey's ruling stood as final word. Land transfers were valid. Manumissions were upheld. Formerly enslaved families of Freedmen's Bend had legal title. But victory was fragile. Within months, creditors began filing claims seeking to seize transferred land to satisfy Eleanor's debts. Greene, using the Legal Defense Fund, fought these claims parcel by parcel. He won some and lost others. By 1841, approximately 40 families still held their land. The rest had been forced to sell or lost title through foreclosure. Those retaining ownership faced constant legal harassment, discriminatory taxation, and ever-present violence threat. But they held on, creating a community of black landowners in the heart of Mississippi slave country, a living monument to Eleanor Mayfield's radical vision. Eleanor was buried in an unmarked grave on the Mayfield estate as requested. She left instructions that no funeral service be held, no monument erected, no public acknowledgement made. "Let my work speak for itself," she had written in a codicil. "I require no other memorial than the freedom of those I have served." Her obituary in the local newspaper ran 2 sentences. Mrs. Eleanor Mayfield, widow of the late Colonel Silas Mayfield, died February 14th at her residence. She is survived by no immediate family. There was no mention of the estate, contracts, legal battles, or the transformation she had engineered. To Jefferson County's white establishment, Eleanor died as she had lived her final years, invisible, dismissed, irrelevant. But to the families of Freedmen's Bend, to the people whose names she had recorded, whose literacy she had taught, whose freedom she had purchased with her health, wealth, and life, Eleanor Mayfield was something else entirely. She was the quiet lady who had borne witness. She was the useless wife who had changed everything. The rediscovery of Eleanor Mayfield's story occurred in waves across more than a century, each revealing new dimensions of her significance. The first wave came in the 1850s, when abolitionist publications began printing excerpts from her ledgers and correspondence. William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator ran a series in 1854 describing a Mississippi woman who defied the slave power from within. Frederick Douglass mentioned her case in an 1856 speech, referring to the planter's wife who chose conscience over comfort, who weaponized law against the lawless system of bondage. These early treatments positioned Eleanor as a moral exemplar, a white Southerner who recognized slavery's evil and acted despite personal cost. But accounts were fragmentary and often inaccurate, conflating Eleanor's story with other manumission cases and lacking documentary evidence demonstrating the systematic nature of her approach. The second wave came during Reconstruction. In 1867, the Freedmen's Bureau surveyed black-owned land in Mississippi and discovered that a cluster of properties in Jefferson County, approximately 35 parcels totaling nearly 800 acres, had been continuously held by black families since before the Civil War, making them among the oldest black-owned lands in the entire state. The survey identified these as the Eleanor's Crossing parcels, named after the settlement that grew from Freedmen's Bend. Bureau investigators interviewed elderly residents who remembered Eleanor and preserved copies of contracts and land deeds she had executed. These documents, combined with testimony from surviving tenant farmers, provided the first comprehensive picture of Eleanor's legal strategy and its long-term effects. But Reconstruction-era interest was short-lived. As the federal government withdrew and white supremacist redemption governments took power in the 1870s, stories of black land ownership and white abolitionist action became politically inconvenient and were actively suppressed. The third wave came in the early 20th century with emerging academic Southern history. In 1923, historian Clarence Moore published Anomalies of Antebellum Property Law, The Mayfield Estate and the Legal Fiction of Contracted Servitude, the first scholarly treatment. Moore's analysis focused on the legal mechanisms Eleanor and Greene employed, arguing their strategy represented sophisticated exploitation of gaps in Mississippi's slave code. Moore was interested in how Eleanor's contracts created what he called a third category of persons, individuals neither fully enslaved nor fully free but occupying intermediate legal status, challenging the binary structure of antebellum racial law. Moore's work established Eleanor's story within legal history and demonstrated that resistance to slavery could take forms other than violent rebellion or underground railroad activity. However, Moore's analysis was limited by available sources and early 20th century racial assumptions. He portrayed Eleanor as an exceptional individual acting from personal eccentricity rather than political conviction, giving little attention to the experiences and agency of enslaved people who participated in her contract system. The fourth wave, the most transformative, began in the 1970s with social history's rise and recovery of black voices. Historian Barbara Fields, working in Mississippi archives in 1974, discovered Augustus Freeman's 1867 narrative, 12 Years in Mississippi Bondage and My Path to Freedom, providing detailed first-person testimony about Eleanor's literacy instruction and her relationships with enslaved people. Fields' subsequent research uncovered additional letters, diary entries and oral histories from Freedman's Bend descendants, creating a richer picture of the enslaved community's role. Fields' 1981 book, The Quiet Rebellion, Eleanor Mayfield and the Politics of Covert Emancipation, argued that Eleanor's actions should be understood not as individual charity but as collaborative resistance, that enslaved people on the Mayfield plantation had been active participants in creating conditions for their own liberation, and that Eleanor had provided legal tools and protection for a freedom struggle that the enslaved community itself had initiated and sustained. This interpretation shifted Eleanor from narrative center to a position as ally and facilitator, recognizing the agency and intelligence of the people she worked with rather than portraying them as passive beneficiaries. Modern historians have continued expanding understanding of Eleanor's significance. Medical historians have re-examined her obesity through disability studies and fat studies, exploring how her body was simultaneously oppression source. She was mocked, dismissed, and socially isolated because of her weight, and a form of protection allowing her to engage in subversive activities without detection. Feminist historians have analyzed Eleanor's use of constraints imposed on women, their supposed weakness, confinement to domestic spaces, exclusion from public life, as cover for political action that would have been impossible for a man to conduct without immediate detection and punishment. Legal historians have traced the influence of Eleanor's contractual approach on post-war labor arrangements, showing how sharecropping contracts that dominated Southern agriculture after emancipation borrowed conceptual frameworks from earlier experiments like Eleanor's tenant farming system, though sharecropping typically operated to black workers' disadvantage. Perhaps most significantly, contemporary historians have explored Eleanor's impact on families who gained land through her will and retained ownership through Reconstruction into the 20th century. Genealogical research has identified more than 200 living descendants of the original Freedman's Bend families, many still living in Mississippi and some still owning portions of land their ancestors received from Eleanor. These families have preserved remarkable archives: land deeds, family Bibles with birth and marriage records, letters, photographs, and oral histories passed through generations. The existence of these multi-generational black landowning families in Mississippi, a state where black land ownership has historically been extremely difficult, represents Eleanor's most tangible and enduring legacy. The land provided economic foundation, social stability, and political independence that shaped these families' trajectories across more than 180 years. Eleanor's story has become important in contemporary debates about reparations for slavery and racial wealth inequality. Economic historians have calculated that land transfers Eleanor executed in the 1830s represented approximately $45,000 in contemporary value, a substantial sum that, had it been allowed to appreciate and compound over generations without the discriminatory taxation, violence, and legal harassment that actually occurred, would be worth millions today. The fact that much land was eventually lost through quasi-legal theft and intimidation makes the Mayfield case a microcosm of broader black land loss patterns in the South, where an estimated 90% of black-owned agricultural land was taken through fraud, violence, or discriminatory legal mechanisms between 1865 and 1970. Eleanor's attempt to create intergenerational wealth transfer from white to black families, and systematic efforts to undo that transfer, illuminate mechanisms through which racial wealth inequality was created and maintained. The Mayfield plantation itself no longer exists as a single property. Land was subdivided repeatedly over decades, and most original structures were demolished or fell into ruin. But a small portion, including the site where Eleanor's Crossing once stood, was preserved by descendant families and listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1994 as Mayfield Freeman Settlement Site. A 2003 historical marker commemorates Eleanor's life. On this land, Eleanor Mayfield, 1798 to 1838, enacted one of the antebellum South's most radical experiments in freedom. Through legal innovation and moral courage, she transformed enslaved people into landowners, creating a community that endured against overwhelming opposition. Her ledgers bore witness. Her contracts spoke freedom. Her legacy lives in the families who still hold this ground. The marker represents official recognition of a story deliberately suppressed for more than a century, and its placement on land still owned by descendants creates direct material connection between past and present. Eleanor Mayfield's historical significance extends across multiple dimensions. In legal history, she demonstrated that even oppressive legal systems contain gaps and ambiguities that can be exploited for liberatory purposes. In abolitionism history, she represents resistance that was neither violent nor public but nonetheless effective and sustained. In women's history, she exemplifies how women excluded from formal political participation could exercise political power through control of property and manipulation of domestic space. In African American history, she facilitated land and wealth transfer with lasting material consequences. In the history of the body and disability, she demonstrates how physical difference can be simultaneously oppressive and protective, how marginalization can create unexpected spaces for resistance. Eleanor Mayfield was not a saint or savior. She was a privileged white woman who owned human beings, who benefited from slavery's violence, and who could never fully escape the racial hierarchy she was born into. But she used the power that hierarchy gave her to dismantle itself, one contract at a time, until the day she died. That is her legacy, imperfect, complicated, and undeniably real. The investigation into Eleanor Mayfield's life reveals a fundamental truth, that systems of oppression, no matter how totalizing they appear, contain within themselves the seeds of their own undoing. Slavery in the antebellum South was a comprehensive architecture of law, custom, violence, and ideology designed to make human bondage appear natural, inevitable, and permanent. It saturated every aspect of Southern life. It defined who could own property and who could be property, who could testify and who had no legal voice. It was, by design, inescapable. Yet Eleanor Mayfield escaped it, or more precisely, she created an escape route for others by exploiting the very comprehensiveness that made the system seem invulnerable. Because slavery touched every aspect of law, there were thousands of individual statutes, precedents, and contractual forms. Because the law attempted to regulate everything, it created gaps between regulations, ambiguities in language, conflicts between different legal authorities. Eleanor, working with Green's legal expertise and building on years of careful observation and documentation, found those gaps and used them to construct something that should have been impossible. A legal pathway from slavery to freedom that did not require fleeing to free territory, did not require violent uprising, did not even require explicitly violating the law. She used the master's tools to dismantle the master's house, and while those tools were imperfect and the dismantling was incomplete, it was real and it mattered. The story illuminates the complex relationship between individual agency and structural constraint. Eleanor was able to act as she did only because of her structural position. She was white, she was wealthy, she inherited property rights that women rarely possessed, and she had access to legal expertise and social capital that the vast majority did not have. Her obesity, which caused her immense suffering and social isolation, also provided protective camouflage that made her subversive activities less visible. Her childlessness, seen as failure, meant she had no heirs whose interests might conflict with her abolitionist commitments. Every advantage she possessed, including those wrapped in oppression, contributed to her capacity to act. Moreover, Eleanor could not have accomplished what she did without the active participation of the enslaved people on the Mayfield plantation. They trusted her enough to attend secret literacy lessons despite enormous risks. They maintained the careful documentation she created. They worked the land as tenant farmers. They endured violence and legal harassment to maintain their land ownership after her death. Eleanor provided tools and legal protection, but the freedom struggle itself was conducted by the people whose freedom was at stake. The individualistic heroic narrative obscures this collaborative reality and diminishes the agency of the black family central to the story. The investigation reveals something profound about documentation and historical memory. Eleanor's most consistent action across the final decade was not dramatic legal maneuvering or public court battles. It was the quiet, daily work of writing things down. She recorded names when the law said enslaved people had no names worth recording. She documented family relationships when the law said enslaved people had no families with legal standing. She copied punishment records meant to be internal documents. She taught people to read so they could create their own documentary records. This was not incidental to her resistance. It was the foundation. The ledgers became evidence in her competency hearing. The contracts became legal instruments that survived her death and protected land ownership for generations. The literacy she taught enabled her students to navigate legal systems, sign their own names and pass knowledge to their children. Eleanor understood that bearing witness is itself a form of power. When systems of oppression function through violence and erasure, through making certain people and experiences invisible and unspeakable, the act of seeing and speaking and recording becomes dangerous and transformative. Eleanor's ledger said, "These people exist, they have names, they have families, they suffer, and I am watching." Her contract said, "These people can enter into agreements, they have legal personhood, their labor has value that belongs to them." Her will said, "These people deserve land and wealth and freedom, and I am using every atom of my legal authority to give them what they deserve." The documents she created were not merely evidence of resistance. They were the resistance itself, written into permanent form so it could not be denied or forgotten. The question of Eleanor's motivation remains partially mysterious. She left no diary explaining her inner life, no memoir detailing her conversion. The evidence suggests influence from Enlightenment-era books in her library, her father's scholarly interests, perhaps religious conviction, though she was never notably devout. But ultimately, the question of motivation may be less important than method and impact. Many people in the antebellum South privately doubted slavery's morality. Very few acted on those doubts in ways that materially challenged the institution. Eleanor did. She transformed doubt into documentation, discomfort into legal strategy, and private conviction into public action. There is danger in Leoneizing Eleanor Mayfield. She was not a perfect abolitionist. She continued to own enslaved people even as she freed others. She benefited materially from slavery throughout her life, and her actions were filtered through the racial hierarchies of her time. She was not a perfect feminist. She never challenged male authority directly, and her resistance worked precisely because she appeared to be a conventional woman who posed no threat. She was not even, by radical abolitionist standards, particularly radical. She worked within the legal system rather than attacking it. She moved incrementally rather than demanding immediate universal emancipation. By these standards, Eleanor Mayfield was a moderate, a gradualist, someone who compromised with evil rather than confronting it directly. Yet the families who still own land in Mississippi because of her actions, the descendants who exist because their ancestors were not sold away, the historical record that preserved names and experiences that would otherwise have been erased, these are not moderate outcomes. They are real, material transformations of human lives across multiple generations. The question is not whether Eleanor's approach was the most radical or most morally pure. It clearly was not, but whether it was effective in creating space for human freedom and dignity within an oppressive system. By that measure, the answer is unambiguously yes. Perfect is the enemy of good, and in a context where perfect was impossible, Eleanor Mayfield achieved something remarkably good. The investigation also forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about our own time and complicity. It is easy to look back at slavery and feel morally superior, to say we would never have participated in such obvious evil. But slavery was not obvious to most people who lived within it. It was normal, legal, economically rational, divinely sanctioned, and defended by the most educated people of the era. The people who benefited did not think of themselves as evil. They thought of themselves as civilized, as maintaining order, as fulfilling their proper roles in a natural hierarchy. We live in systems today, economic systems that concentrate wealth and consign billions to poverty, environmental systems that sacrifice long-term sustainability for short-term profit, political systems that exclude and marginalize vulnerable populations, that future generations may judge as harshly as we now judge slavery. We benefit from these systems, we participate in them, we defend them with sophisticated arguments. The question Eleanor Mayfield's story poses is not whether we are as evil as slaveholders. Moral comparisons across historical contexts are usually unproductive, but whether we are paying attention to the violence and suffering our systems produce, whether we are documenting what we see, whether we are looking for gaps and ambiguities we might exploit to create space for change, and whether we are willing to use whatever power and position we have to make things even incrementally better for people with less power. The investigation revealed that power does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers in a quiet library while teaching forbidden letters. Sometimes it scratches across a ledger page, recording names that were meant to remain unrecorded. Sometimes it sits immobile in a courtroom, a fat woman in morning dress reciting plantation statistics from memory, demonstrating competence that was supposed to be impossible. Sometimes it lies waiting in a will, transferring land to people who were never supposed to own anything. Eleanor Mayfield's body, mocked, dismissed, confined, used as evidence of her unworthiness, became the site of rebellion. In the language of ownership and property rights, in the bureaucratic forms of contracts and deeds, in the meticulous documentation of violence and resistance, she wrote the first quiet act of freedom. She bore witness until witnessing became action, until documentation became liberation, until the weight of the law itself began to shift toward justice. The investigation ends not with answers but with recognition, that resistance takes many forms, that power can be found in unexpected places, that even the most comprehensive systems of oppression contain the possibility of their own transformation. Eleanor Mayfield found that possibility and made it real. Her ledgers bore witness. Her contracts spoke freedom. Her silence thundered across generations.